legislation, I would now call H.R. 367 to the committee, asking unanimous consent to discharge Subcommittee Coast Guard Maritime Transportation from further consideration of H.R. 367. That be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I do have an amendment in the nature of substitute. Clerk, report the amendment.
Amendment in nature of substitute to H.R. 367, offered by Mr. DeFazio, number 01.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as base text for purposes of the amendment. I will now recognize myself on H.R. 367. The Coast Guard's one of our 5 armed uniformed services. It was ironic during the shutdown. I was talking to, I think it was my regional commandant, and he was talking about how the coasties were working to escort the subs at Bangor. The mariners, the naval folks in the subs were getting paid, and the Coast Guard providing critical security were not being paid. And I mean, this sort of equity is not proper. There was notably a Coast Guard support group put out guidance for coasties during this very long shutdown. It was particularly hard on junior officers and enlisted ranks, particularly those newest to the service. And the guidance was you could become a dog walker, you could hold a garage sale, blah, 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 et cetera. That is insulting to a critical uniformed service, in the defense of our country, Homeland Security, and also doing double duty with law enforcement and border issues. So, I believe that the Coast Guard should get their pay if the members of the armed forces are getting their pay. The amendment in the nature of a substitute provides permanent authority to appropriate funds to pay members of the Coast Guard. I urge my colleagues on both sides to support the bill. I would now recognize, now will follow my script, and recognize the subcommittee chair, Maloney, to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. You have been articulate and passionate about this, and it is much appreciated. As you mentioned, during the recent government shutdown, for the first time in our nation's history, members of an armed force were not paid due to a lapse in appropriations. The men and women of the Coast Guard and their families continued to serve honorably without pay. It was unacceptable and something we must not allow to occur again. H.R. 367, the Pay Our Coast Guard Parity Act, will ensure that members of the Coast Guard and their families do not suffer a similar fate in the future. It's a bipartisan bill, which I was proud to co-author with our chairman, and it would provide pay and benefits for active duty and reserve Coast Guard members, as well as pay and allowances for civilian employees and contractors of the Coast Guard. The bill also provides for the payment of death gratuities, funeral travel, and a housing allowance for dependents of Coast Guard members dying on active duty. And indeed, we lost a member of the Coast Guard recently who was from my district in Mahopac, New York. These are real issues that our Coast Guard families face. The bill also provides retired pay for 50,000 retired Coast Guard members, fulfilling the contract they made with the nation by a career of service. The authority provided by this bill is only triggered when members of the Coast Guard are the only members of the armed forces not receiving pay. The authority terminates when a continuing resolution or appropriation is enacted for the Coast Guard. The availability of appropriations to pay members of the Department of Defense Armed Forces terminates, or 180 days after the beginning of the lapse in Coast Guard funding. This committee has jurisdiction over the armed force outside, the only armed force outside the Department of Defense, and it is our responsibility to ensure that the members of the Coast Guard and their families are not forgotten or treated differently from their counterparts in the other services. During the recent shutdown, the Department of Defense Armed Forces received pay and were not impacted by the lapse. This bill provides parity for the Coast Guard by providing assurance that they will not be treated differently in the future. And I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I would note that Representative Cummings, who also chairs the, whatever we call it, committee now, oversight? Or? Oversight. Yeah, oversight. We change the names around here when the majority changes. It gets confusing, and Ed wished to be here, but he was called back to his alternate duty. With that, would recognize the ranking member for any statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This piece of legislation is common sense, and it does ensure fairness among the five branches of the armed services when it comes to payment during an appropriations lapse. And with that, I support the amendment in the form of a substitute and urge my colleagues to do the same and yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Representative Graves?
Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, I'll get you next.
Oh.
Yep. Sorry, yeah, go ahead, Bob. He yielded to you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to concur with everything that's been said. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this, and as it's been said, that Coast Guard didn't get paid during the fiscal year 2019 appropriations lapse, and the other military forces did. All 367 calls for members of Coast Guard, civilian employees, and retirees to be paid during the lapse of a in the fiscal year, and the amendment in the nature of the substitute will ensure that members of Coast Guard get paid during any lapse, if there's any going on further. So I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Any on the Democratic side wish to be heard? Okay, if not, I recognize Representative Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, very quickly, we had a long discussion in this committee about the pain inflicted by a government shutdown, and we talked about how we need to be careful about making shutdowns easy, and how I personally believe that members of Congress shouldn't be paid. We should be required to report to duty every day until we get this issue, get shutdowns resolved. But one thing that distinguishes the Coast Guard from every other federal employee, with the exception of the other military services, is that Coasties are locked into a contract. They are obligated to show up to work every day. It's not like they can say, oh, well, I'm just going to quit this job and go on to another one. So I think it's an important distinguishing factor for members to keep in mind. They don't have the luxury of saying, well, if I'm not getting paid here, I'm going to get another job. They are under contract. They're obligated to show up, and they are the only military service that's treated this way. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gibbs, Congressman Maloney, I want to thank all of you for bringing this up. I think it's an important fix. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. That is an excellent point of clarification. In fact, we did lose some people who worked under FAA because of the lack of pay, where particularly inspectors are paid at a level less than the private sector, and some. We also had trainees for the FAA who were in the middle of training, some of whom did not return after the lapse, but all those people had options. As the gentleman pointed out, that is not an option available to Coasties. Any other members wish to be heard on the amendment, on the bill? Okay. If not, then are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute for H.R. 367? Hearing none, we would move on to final passage. Question is now on adoption and favorably reporting H.R. 367 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, saying nay. The ayes have it. Bill is amended, is approved, and ordered reported favorably to the House. We now move on to